Welcome to For the Purpose Of, the podcast where we navigate the intersection of technology and the world of education. I'm Keith Tramper.
And I'm Ron Houtman.
And I'm Sarah Wood. Today we'll be having a special guest join us, Liz Kolb, and we'll be talking more about her EEE framework.
And we always start every one of our podcasts out with a question for all of our audience to ponder. And well, Sarah and Keith also, because they ponder every once in a while. So just reflecting on this first year, we're at the first year anniversary of ChatGPT and all these AIs kind of being unleashed upon us. Kind of wonder, how do you assess the impact on our digital landscape, and where do you see this technology taking us in the near future? Sarah.
So I just would like to wish everyone a happy GPT-versary then.
Yep.
At this point. And I struggled when I was thinking about this, because even though we're a year in, you think we'd have like, okay, I'm feeling X, Y, or Z about this. I'm feeling a little more confident in it. But I feel like the landscape is still changing every day, and the uses, the applications, the tools are just still popping up all the time, or giving new updates and things that you can do with it. But I think it is really a great conversation starting point in how AI can be used in the education world, even if we're not actively, if everyone, I should say, is not actively using it. We now have a framework where we can start talking about it and going like, okay, I've heard this, I've seen this, but really, how does that work for me in my own practice? And really just starting the conversation, even if you're not using it yet.
Yeah, when we think about any kind of technology tool, we're really looking at how it can make us more efficient or more effective, right? And I think AI has the potential to do both of those. I think that's sort of what you're pointing at there, Sarah. And I think that's where we're going to have to focus our energy as we get into it. I had the opportunity to hear Eric Kurtz talk about AI. And one of the things that stuck with me about it was his quote was, "A human is not the best teacher. A computer is not the best teacher, but a human using a computer is the best teacher." So I think learning to leverage the tools that are out there are really important as we move forward. And I hope we keep that moving in the right direction. I think it also brings up two things that have kind of been sitting with me. One is data privacy. And we talked about this at our last podcast, and I didn't think to bring this up, but when we're using things like ChatGPT, it's easy to take something and just copy and paste it right into the tool and then say, hey, compile some analytics on this data or summarize this article. And I think we just have to be really careful as educators, because we do have a lot of student data. If we're using a tool like ChatGPT and dumping all that data in there, are we being conscious of the FERPA violations that we might have just caused, or the HIPAA stuff, or even COPPA issues there? Like, there's just a lot of angles to that I think the lines are not as easily delineated as they have been with past tools. And the other one, I think, is ethics. That conversation around digital citizenship that's been going on for years and years and has always been important, but probably undervalued. I think that is shifting with the AI landscape too. Still the same message: be responsible, be respectful, be safe. But how does that look when we're talking about AI?
Yep, it's a real good question when you start talking about data privacy, because the royal we, when we talk about it in most education organizations, haven't really put this into policies yet that I've seen, in large part. So a lot of times the policies have been talking about student use of these, how plagiarism is like the number one concern. And I think it's not at all, because cheating on stuff is a lifelong skill, and you will do this forever. And did it really ever matter? I mean, really, when you really get down to it. I think that the data privacy side that we haven't really dove into is, have we as educational organizations made sure that we're telling our staff to not upload any data, even if it's anonymized data? Because if you have an account with one of these, it still knows where it's coming from. So, and it can make some certain inferences about people as well. So I would really wonder, what the policies are going to look like going forward. And I think the biggest impact that I'm seeing just out there still, and there's probably two areas. In the education sphere, we still see all of these people that are giving presentations on AI and what the parlor tricks are that they do, including myself. I've done these too, and I'm sure Sarah and Keith, you both have done one of these, at least one. I wonder when that's going to stop and we start really talking about real usage of these things and helping people understand how to create really good prompts to be able to do things with it, instead of just talking about what it is. And we're going to get into how to use it effectively. I've seen some people do that, but in the large scale edu conferences, I've only just seen when I read all the transcripts or the proposals, it's like what it is, not how to use it really, really well. And I think it leads to the second point that I see happening. I think we're going to get into a pretty interesting digital divide here of those that really know how to unleash the capacities of ChatGPT and their contemporaries, and those that don't. And we're going to see a pretty big separation of people that really know how to use the tools really well, and they kind of propel themselves up and to the right. And those that can't use these things are going to be left behind, because it takes a really certain skill set to create a query and a prompt that actually gets what you want out of it. If you're asking simple questions, Google search works great. But if you're asking complex questions, you want to do data analysis and generate really good ideas, you have to have that vocabulary to be able to talk to the tool, to be able to describe what it is that your outcome is, what your goals are, and in which formats that you would like it. If you don't have that vocabulary to be able to do that, you're going to be kind of left behind. So I think that's where when the royal we, when you talk about education technologists and teachers, I think, that's it's going to be a good future skill. I think we should probably be helping our littles understand the prompts a lot better. And I think it would help them get into more of when you think about logic, right? And a logistical speaking, I guess, might be the words that I would use to do that, help our kids do that.
Bringing it back to the who, what, where, when, why, how.
Yeah. But I just think about that as, when you're little, you ask a lot of times, why?
Why?
Right? The why question.
Why?
But you don't have that vocabulary to create your prompt that would be goal oriented, to be able to explain to something, hey, this is my goal, and I want you as my AI to act like this certain persona, and your output should be this, and I want it to be in a casual tone, whatever those things may be. I think our kids, it's going to take a little while to get to that. Even as adults, it's hard to sometimes talk about what your goal is using the tools.
Yeah, I think there's even a layer under that too that we need to be talking about, and that's the equity, the access to it. There's a lot of great tools out there, but many of them are paid. Actually, almost all of them are, because it's expensive to do AI and call those prompts. And I could see this, if we're not conscious of that, really making that digital divide that we've been working hard to eliminate, just turning it into a huge chasm. Yep. So we got to be conscious and careful of that too.
Yep. And on that high note, I watched, for whatever reason, I don't know why this was on, but Terminator Genesis this weekend. That was like the wrong thing to watch.
What?
Have you not seen Terminator Genesis?
No.
I don't think I have.
So I don't know if it's the last one of the Terminator series or what, but it's really about an AI taking over the whole planet. So, yeah, you should probably just go watch the trailer on that, and you're like, oh, we're there again. Here we are.
All right.
End of days.
Yeah. All right. Thanks. So next, we'll just have our very short commercial, our FTPO PDX reflection, and then we'll talk to our guest.
New varieties of Oreos keep popping up, and I hear they've made an artificially intelligent Oreo. It's one smart cookie. No jokes about it. AI has been here for a while and will continue to grow and evolve. It is important that educators are aware of what it is, and it's so much more than just ChatGPT, and how it can be leveraged as a teaching and learning tool. Register today for EdTech Cheer 2023, which will take place in the first 2 weeks of December, where you can engage in micro-learning where the focus will be on topics surrounding the world of artificial intelligence. Claim your spot today for free at bit.ly/etc23-register and earn up to 6 sketch credits. This commercial was written by Human for Humans. Join me in embracing the world of AI. And yes, no AI bots were used in crafting this commercial.
Hey PDX listeners, we hope you're enjoying the podcast. It's been so fun reading your reactions to our podcast in the PDX community. I can't wait to hear what you have to say about this episode. This episode's podcast PDX question is, which of the 3 E's resonates the most with you and why? Keep listening to learn about the 3 E's in our conversation with Liz Kolb. And to learn more about Podcast PDX and become a member of the For the Purpose Of community, head over to bit.ly/FTPO PDX.
And welcome back. We are excited to jump into our guest interview for today, in which we have Liz Kolb here, who is a clinical professor in education technology in the teacher education department at the University of Michigan. So welcome, Liz.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here today.
Before we jump into some questions, just a little bit of backstory on you to help us understand how you came to be where you're at today and some of the work that you've done. Could you share a little bit of your education origin story with us?
Sure. I love that question. So, to kind of go way back, I was a struggling student when I was in school. In my primary and secondary education, I was a student who was on an IEP, and I often kind of let that define me. And in defining me, I really kind of checked out of school. So for me, I never really thought of education as something that would be successful for me. I was kind of a C/D student when I was in high school, and I had kind of a change moment when I was in 11th grade, and that was in my English class. We had started a book, The Canterbury Tales, which I'm sure some are familiar, and I never read any books for a class because I had a processing delay issue. So I really struggle with reading. And the teacher approached me when we started this book and he said, Liz, I'm pretty sure that you have not been reading the books in class. And of course he was correct. And he said, I really want you to read this book. But instead of writing the paper, like all the other students are doing at the end of the book, I'll let you do something else. And he said, tell me, what do you like to do? And that was such an interesting question for me because nobody had really asked me what I like to do. And I told him, I said, well, I really love to make mixtapes. This was in the 80s. So I had a boombox and I had a dual cassette recorder and I would make mixtapes and DJ and all of that. And he said, great, I want you to read the Canterbury Tales. And when you're done, make me a mixtape about the Canterbury Tales. And it was like this really interesting challenge for me. And he actually sat down with me and helped me read the book and show me some really great tricks that I use to this day with being able to just read more complex texts. And I read the book. I didn't understand all of it, but I read it. And in the end, I spent hours making this amazing mixtape. And when I finished the mixtape, I handed it in and I ended up getting an A on it. And it was the first time I had received an A in a class. And it made me realize that maybe all these years where I was thinking I wasn't smart because of my IEP, maybe I am smart, but just in a different way than a typical student would be. And it was also a time when I was very connected with technology. So fast forward, when I decided to become a teacher, I really wanted to work with struggling students because I could really identify with them. And one of the things I'd always ask them, of course, is what do you like to do? And most of the time, many times technology was a big part of what they like to do, whether it was in the 90s with like a Walkman or CDs or video games or, fast forward now with all sorts of crazy things. But I did find that technology is a way to connect students' kind of everyday lives with some of the content that seems complicated to them or uninteresting to them. So that's kind of where I came from in terms of my education and also just my interest with technology.
I love that and how such a simple question really changed your perspective and your learning, your confidence in yourself and what you could do and kind of how it pushed you forward. I love that. So I guess kind of jumping forward to where we're at today, can you share a little bit about what you do and why you do where you're at now?
Sure. So I currently have the privilege of being able to prepare new teachers to teach at the University of Michigan. And I see hundreds of new teachers, pre-service teachers every year. And my specialty is education technology. So I get to work with just about every single one of them on preparing them to use technology to teach. And one of the big reasons why I ended up in this field, I was a social studies and computer science teacher when I was a middle and high school teacher. And I started off in social studies, never thinking I'd end up in technology. But of course, many, many years ago, if you knew how to use like PowerPoint, you all of a sudden became the tech coordinator of the school, which is what happened to me. And what I realized when I was the tech coordinator was that I was doing things with technology based on my gut rather than knowledge of any kind of research or evidence based. I'd go to conferences and I'd see vendors and I'd get really excited and giddy and I'd get money to bring in all sorts of new shiny tools. And then I started, and I would encourage my teachers to use these things. And it took me many, many years to realize that I wasn't really changing learning outcomes by just using shiny tools. I might have gotten students a little bit more excited for a moment, but I wasn't really changing the trajectory of their learning or enhancing it in any great way. And so when I started to realize that, I wanted to get more education around what it means to have evidence-based technology use. And so I started to look into higher education and found that a lot of the preparation for teachers in the early 2000s, when I moved to higher ed, was very shallow in terms of, you were still learning just how to use a tool rather than how to think about how that tool works with instructional pedagogy and evidence-based use. So I found that there was a real need for people who were looking more deeply at technology tools and understanding when and when not to use them and what best practices mean. So that's kind of what led me here today. And so I spend a lot of time with pre-service teachers, letting them know it's okay to not always use technology and that technology is not the cure-all, but it is a tool and it can be a useful tool if it's used in ways that are really supporting what the students need in the learning goals.
That is so true. And sometimes it's hard to like look past the shiny, bright new tool because you're like, wow, this is amazing. But really focusing in on what is the impact that will have on student learning and will it actually affect outcomes, things
Yeah,
like that.
right. Yeah, I
Yeah.
get excited about new tools, and then I have to like catch myself that all right, it's a tool, so I can put it in my toolbox, but it doesn't mean I have to make everybody use this.
Absolutely. So hearing you say that, I think it kind of leads me to my next question, and you've shared what you do in your work now, but I'm guessing that kind of led you down the route where you started to develop this triple E framework. I'm assuming, but I would love to hear more about that because I know like your name is very synonymous with that, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about your journey into the triple E world.
Sure, yeah. So my journey started over a decade ago. As I said, I've been working with pre-service teachers and teaching them. And at the time, we were focused heavily on TPAC, and I'm still a big proponent of TPAC. But my pre-service teachers were struggling with TPAC because it's more of a theoretical framework, and it's not a practical framework. So it's this theoretical idea of all of these knowledges should be coming together. But my pre-service teachers were like, yeah, that makes sense. But what does that look like in practice? And that's where we were getting stumped. And at the same time that this was happening, I was doing some research on schools that had just gone one-to-one, one device per child. And that was a much more newer phenomenon then than it is now. And so I was going and doing a lot of observations and interviews and talking to people. And what I found was I kept seeing a similar thing happen over and over again. And I write about this in my book, which is where I would go into a classroom where they have one-to-one devices and all the students are very focused on the devices and they're often using some kind of maybe adaptive software or drill practice software. And the teacher's so excited because the students are really engaged in using the devices. But when I would look more closely at what was happening, I found that the students weren't really focused on the learning goal within the software they were using. So if they were supposed to be learning about, their math facts The students were finding ways to kind of quickly get through the math fact questions so they could get to the game at the end, or so that they could go shop for their avatar. So they were getting kind of distracted by other fun things in the tool that were meaningless to the learning goal. And so what I realized was that they were kind of having this behavioral engagement, but not really a true kind of cognitive engagement with the learning goals. And so this really bothered me because I noticed this happened in the majority of the classrooms I was in. And it was giving us a sense of kind of false engagement and probably not really leading to the learning outcomes we wanted. So that's when I started to really comb through the research on ed tech at the time to find out, how do students learn best with technology? And what I found was definitely not rocket science. It was something I already knew, that educators already know. And it was just that the best practices we learn when it comes to good pedagogy with students needed to also be involved when we use technology. And sometimes technology will say, just plunk the tool in front of the student and they will just magically learn with the software. But we know we can't really plunk anything in front of students and they'll just magically learn. We need scaffolds and supports and all sorts of strategies with it. So I developed the Triple E framework based on what the evidence said was best practices with learning, and definitely with learning with technology. So this kind of 9-question, people call it a rubric or an assessment tool or guidelines, but this 9-question tool came about because they're just reminders that we want to make sure that these best practices of learning are present when we're using the technology. And if they're not present, then we want to really kind of rethink, should we be using this tool, or maybe we should be using it in a different way. So it's definitely nothing new. I think I just kind of took what we knew best and tried to put it into a usable tool, especially for busy teachers who don't have time to, go through 50 questions or try to figure out a complicated matrix. We just need something really quick. And this is quick, and you can memorize it to the point where you never have to actually look at the rubric once you kind of get used to it.
Yeah, it's such a simple but powerful message to say, like, be intentional, and here's how when you're selecting the technology for your lessons. And that's what I've always been drawn to in the Triple E framework that you created. I'm wondering if you could tell our listeners a little bit about, what are the 3 E's in the Triple E, and what are those 9 questions that you're talking about?
Sure. So the 3 E's stand for engagement in the learning goals, enhancement in the learning goals, and extension of the learning goals. So those are our 3 E's. And they're all real. What I've learned is that they're all equally important. So even though the first E is engagement, it doesn't mean engagement is more important than extension. They all should be present in a lesson as best as possible. But with each one, they each have 3 questions associated with them that have evidence to support what that actually looks like. So what does engagement in learning when using technology look like? Well, the first piece is that the technology tool should not be distracting from the learning goals. And we know technology tools can be very distracting, right? Lots of bells and whistles. Most ed tech tools are actually not made by educators. So a lot of the people who make them think everybody learns from multiple choice questions and lots of games and bonus stickers. So, even at the University of Michigan, if you make an ed tech tool, it goes through the School of Engineering and the business school. It doesn't really go through the School of Education. So it's important to make sure it's undistracted. The second one is that is the actual technology helping to motivate the students to focus on the learning goals and to get involved with it. And I always say there's a little credit you can give for something maybe being a little bit unique. In other words, I think back to my education, and I think back to that mixtape that I made, that's kind of a unique experience. But the question is, did the mixtape and using that technology, did it actually motivate me to want to learn more about the Canterbury Tales? So really trying to dive into that. And then the last part of it is that learning is social. Like social is a really important part of learning, and social is a really important part of learning with technology. So is the use of the technology allowing students to be social and talk about what they're doing with the learning goals? And also, is it allowing them to be hands-on with the technology and the learning goals? So all of that focuses on the learning goals. Each question says, how does this impact the learning goals? Not just are students having fun with the technology? So that's engagement in a nutshell. And then enhancement talks about students should be using their higher level thinking skills. So if we think of the top level of Bloom's taxonomy, they should be creating, analyzing, synthesizing when they're using technology. We've definitely learned from tons of research that when students just stay in kind of this remember, understand, or drill practice level, the technology doesn't really have a benefit. And sometimes it actually has the opposite. So we want to be really careful of that. And then we also want to be intentional about choosing technology tools. The second part of enhancement is making sure that they are making the learning easier. So providing those scaffolds or supports for the students. For example, maybe it allows the students to choose different levels of challenges in a piece of software, or maybe it's, highlighting certain terms and words for students that might have some kind of processing needs for reading. So what is it doing to make the learning easier? Because it can go either way with that. And then finally, the last part of enhancement is there a value added over the traditional? And I always encourage teachers to think about how would you do this project or this lesson if you didn't have technology? And then thinking about this technology that you're adding in here, whether you're making, a movie or a podcast or whatever you're doing, is there a value added over the traditional? What is it doing or bringing that enhances this lesson somehow? And if you say, actually, no, we could do this without it, then do it without it, because technology always has issues and takes extra time and there's troubleshooting. So maybe this is not a lesson for technology. And then the third E, extension, it's my favorite E. Am I allowed to say that? And I think it's the most powerful of the E's, which is that, technology should support students connecting to their real world, so that when students are learning in the classroom, they should be able to go outside of their classroom and immediately make those connections. And technology can definitely go from 6 degrees of separation to 1 degree of separation. And that's really what extension is all about. And it's also about soft skills and making sure our students are getting some of those soft skills, but that shouldn't be the main focus of the lesson. It should still really have that real world connection as much as possible. And then the last part of extension is just making sure the tools we're choosing for the students are as accessible as possible, because one of the things we've learned about transfer is that students are more likely to transfer something the more that they are able to use and do the same thing. So if they're able to use the same tool in the classroom that they can use when they walk outside of school, they're more likely to kind of transfer and make those connections in their everyday life. So those are the 3 E's in a nutshell.
Awesome. I'm really glad to hear you say that extension is kind of your favorite, because that's mine as well. And it sort of is what drives me in the work that we do. And I've always said students impact the world as part of their learning, right? And I think that's really what you're getting at. It's not as a result of the learning, it's part of it.
Yeah.
And extending it. Yeah. So now that we've heard a little bit about the Triple E framework, could you tell us maybe one story or a scenario you've been in where you've seen a teacher use the Triple E framework, or maybe you've used it, and you've seen the outcomes of a lesson just go through the roof because of that intentional focus on the use of technology?
Sure. I have a great example of that. There is one of my former students, his name is Kelly Grawl. When he was a student of mine, he encountered the learning goal of informational text in his 3rd grade classroom. And I remember him coming to me and saying, oh, I've got the informational text learning goal. And he was not excited about it. And he said, I think I'm just going to have the students study animals and make brochures about animals. Students just like animals. And I was like, yeah, maybe. And I said, but have you actually asked your students what they want to learn about? Is there something in real life that they're interested in learning about? And he was like, oh, okay, maybe I'll do that. So he went back to school the next day and he asked them, And he came back to me and he said, "You're never going to believe this. The students said they want to," and this was a few years ago, I should mention that, but he said the students said they want to learn about the Flint water crisis. And he was in a classroom in, I believe he was in Ypsilanti, Michigan. And Flint, is about a little over an hour away. And there was a lot of information in the news about the Flint water crisis. And so his students clearly had heard about it, but they didn't really understand it or know what it was. So he completely changed his lesson and was like, okay, we're going to let this drive the lesson. And he kind of said, like, so what are my next steps here? They want to learn about the Flint water crisis. And I said, well, you have a Twitter feed, so why don't you tweet out and see if there's a classroom in Flint that might be willing to like connect with you? And he's like, oh yeah, I love that idea. So he did, and he found a fourth grade classroom that said, let's be pen pals and let's make this into a project. And the fourth grade teacher said their students really wanted to share their stories about their experiences of living through the Flint water crisis from a kid's perspective. So Kelly made this project where first they started to connect just digitally as pen pals. And then for their informational text, he said, why don't we co-write and co-author a book about kids living during the Flint water crisis? So they ended up using PictoChart. I think that's what it was called, which is like a infographic type tool, but it was a tool where you could like co-write together on it and co-collaborate and use visuals. And so his students interviewed the fourth grade students, and then then his students kind of wrote up their interviews and put them together in text and added images and pictures from the students in the fourth grade classroom and kind of became these investigative reporters. And they ended up publishing these books, and they put them in the libraries all across the state of Michigan so that they had these real life published pieces. And I think that's a really great example of making sure that the learning goal is really driving the choices of technology. Originally he was like, we're going to make pamphlets and we're going to just use this little template I made to do them. And then when his students were like, no, we have a passion project. We have something we really want. So here it's connecting with the real world. So we're getting that extension piece. They're using the technology tools to connect to the real world. And they're also choosing a tool that's going to scaffold their learning by being able to kind of set up a little template and then being able to add in the information they learned. They're using higher thinking skills and problem solving skills and creating and analyzing. And the tools weren't really distracting to them because they were really focused on getting their work out. And it was very social, very hands-on. So when you think about those different categories of the EEE, it really hit all of them compared to what he originally had planned on doing. So I think that's an example also of just making sure that the learning goal is driving what's going on, but also talking to the students about how it would best connect to what they're interested in, because that will push it even further into students being motivated to do the work.
Yeah. Gosh, what an incredible story. I got goosebumps a couple times just listening to it. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, sure.
And thanks, Liz. I appreciate that too. As just thinking about how you are making more connections outside of your classroom. We have attempted in the past to try to do lots of project-based learning here, even in Kent County with a school, which it was a lab school, to try to push this idea further out into our local districts. But we found that really hasn't gained a whole lot of traction, mostly because it's very difficult to do project-based learning, especially in a large scale. So when we think about the other side of this, when you think about older adults and many of the jobs that all of us here hold and many of our listeners, when you think about professional development, how might we use the EEE framework really to engage our adult learners that we have, or those that are current teacher practitioners? How do you see the framework working well with them?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. There's a few different pieces that I think about with this. Like, one is clearly making sure that our practitioners are just fully aware of the EEE framework. But a second layer of that is making sure that their administrators are fully aware of the EEE framework, so that when they're evaluated on their observational walkthroughs, that they aren't being negatively evaluated because of technology choices they're making. So, for example, I know that sometimes there are some administrators that, with good intentions, but falsely think that if my teachers aren't using the shiny latest technology in their classroom, or if they're not doing big projects with it, then that's not good use of technology, which goes against everything in the Triple E framework. It really isn't about how big or shiny. It really is about the learning goal. And so for our administrators to understand that if you walk into a classroom and the only tech use you see is the teacher projecting maybe like a satellite map in front of the classroom, and the administrator maybe not understanding that this is actually really great use because maybe they're using it to collect, show real world data with mathematical predictions or something along those lines, then, the teacher may not get the evaluation that they're looking for. So I think it's really important that, yes, that we're letting our practitioners know how the Triple E works, but it's even more important that the people who are leading them fully understand it and understand that technology is truly a tool and that all the tools are options, whether it's Microsoft Word or the latest AI tool, whatever it is, everything is an option. And just because it's shiny doesn't mean it's better. So I think that's definitely an important piece. But I also think a really important piece with our adult learners is giving them the peace of mind that they're still the experts in the room, no matter what technology is placed in front of them. And they have much more knowledge than that technology does, or the vendor that's promoting the technology tool. So they still have every right to be the critical consumers and users and the gatekeepers for their classrooms with the technology tool. They know best what their students need. And I think the Triple E framework helps them with that. We have, so I've been talking about the Triple E framework for lesson planning, but I do have another tool that we use just for ed app evaluation to kind of evaluate whether or not an app makes sense for your classroom based on the 3 E's and what it could potentially do. And so I do think it's really important that our practitioners are empowered with the decision making around the tools that come into their classroom and based on their students' needs. And I know that's hard for school districts because one third grade teacher may be really great at using an adaptive learning software for literacy learning and find it useful, and they have great strategies to use it. But the teacher next door teaching the same grade may have their own strategies and approaches that don't need technology at all, and they do a great job with that, and their students are, excellent readers. And so I do think it is important that teachers see that there's a lot of empowerment in this tool. And I hope that it gives them the power back in terms of being the experts in the room for making decisions for what's best for their students and their goals.
Yeah, I think it's really important to have rubrics or tools like that when you're thinking about all those different criteria, like engagement and alignment with your curriculum, supporting your learning goals, the ease of use, the ability to provide feedback and assessment. I think far too long we've turned these apps, we think they're just going to be everything and it's going to solve all of your educational problems. And I think you alluded to earlier, many of the folks that are coming out with lots of education apps, they don't have a background in education and pedagogy. They have an idea like this will be cool because it's got flashing things and it's a puzzle, or it's got video game characters that you have to shoot. It's like, yeah. Have you ever talked to Liz yet? I mean, you really should before you decide to go spend, 1,000 hours of development time to roll this thing out. That's whatever it is. Anyway, I know a lot of folks, they have the hope they're going to get purchased. That's the way, it's not necessarily cynical, but that's always what I think about is people come up with these things to see if they can get bought by a bigger company.
Yeah, well, and that's their number one goal is not student learning.
Yeah.
I can't emphasize that enough, right? It's not students. They don't really care ultimately if students are learning. They want them to get kind of addicted to it, and they want schools to think their students are learning through it with lots of fancy data. Or
isn't it fun when you ask them for evidence of learning? They look at you like you just hit them in the face with a pie, yeah, we did our own research, and our own research says, it's like
they always do their own.
Yeah. Do you have any peer reviews or anything like that, or any longitudinal data? Yeah. And I always ask that in conference floors, when somebody pitches a new app and they just look at me like, go away, here's some swag. Will you just leave my table, please?
You clearly know too much, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
No, but exactly what you're doing, Ron, is what we should be asking those questions. I mean, it's amazing how many apps have zero valid and reliable independent research.
Yeah.
I mean, they have their own, but that's cherry picked and biased. Very few have it.
Yeah. It's sad, but unfortunately, most of us, it's back to, you said it already. You said it's shiny, so when we see shiny stuff, we go to a conference or somebody takes us out for lunch, we decide to go purchase this product. I think, as educational leaders, we really need to think about all these things that we're doing, and not jump for the first shiny thing that we get to, but really dive deep into, if you want to call it classical educational theory and practice first, instead of going to that's shiny. So
yeah,
I think all of us see it all the time, and we just kind of cringe at this. Is like, where did this come from? Well, somebody took someone to lunch. So,
right.
anyway.
And it's expensive,
Yeah.
right? I mean, so much money and the upkeep, right? And the maintenance of it. There's a lot to trying to sustain and maintain all of these different apps and the licensing. And
Yep.
you have to ask what's worth it and what's not.
Yeah. The sustainability question, that's one of the ones that all of us always ask as consultants is, what's your funding stream look like after you get rid of your trial period here or whatever, when it becomes from free to freemium to fully paid. I think we're going to see that. This is we've talked about this in prior podcasts too. We just talked about all the AI tools are just flooding the market. And you're going to see more and more of those when the new ISTE conference or ASCD or whatever they're called this month. When that conference comes, that's all you're going to see out on the conference floor is everybody's got a new edu app. And I've said this a lot is, almost all of these education apps, they're kind of just wrapping ChatGPT, Google's Palm model, Anthropic's Claude, whoever else is out there, Bard. I don't think Bard. Yeah. But really, you're making like a thin wrapper on top of those products, and you're selling your wrapper and not your real engine yet. So it's going to be a little while before I think we see something that's a real game changer for education. I think Conmigo is one of those, which is pretty slick. But again, we still need to go through and evaluate these things before we just jump on whatever we think is the coolest, newest thing, just because, as I always say, it solves all of our educational problems.
It's like the snake oil, right?
Exactly.
So we need to stop being like the trained crows and be more like analytical crows. Oh, well, thank you so much for sharing, Liz. I'm floored at all the information you've shared, and just like I think your experiences and the stories that you've shared with us just adds to like how deep the EEE can really be as a tool in framing learning and really making sure that outcomes and goals are at the forefront of everything. And I know we talked a lot about different things here, but is there anything we didn't get to that you'd like to mention?
Great question. I think we talked around this, but just to make it very explicit and transparent, if there's anything I've learned from my 20 years of diving into all of this research and evidence-based pieces and what's not evidence-based, is that the one thing that technology comes down to, and I think I'm preaching to the choir here, the one thing it comes down to is really those instructional strategies that the teachers use, right? Those expert teachers making the choices about how the tool's used, when it's used, why it's used, what the students are doing within it, whether they're pairing students up, whether they're chunking things, like that's what makes all the difference. I've definitely seen, two pieces of research on the same tool and very different outcomes. And it all comes down to what instructional strategies teachers use, which also means there's no such thing as a bad tool, I guess you could say. And there's no such thing as a great tool. A great teacher can make a tool that doesn't have any instructional pedagogy useful by the pedagogy that they put in around it. So the teacher really makes the difference, and a well-trained teacher who understands how students learn, that is the key and what you want when it comes to the magic of technology in your classroom, not an individual tool itself.
I love that. And we always say that the teacher knows their students the best. And that's really what it is. And you know what strategies work best for your students and when to apply those strategies. So thank you again for joining us. And if any of our listeners have any questions or would like to reach out to you, what would be the best way for them to do so?
Sure. I'm very active on Twitter, or X now, I guess, right? So I'm at L Kolb on that network. And also you can always send me an email to my UMich account, ELIKEREN @umich.edu. And I'm happy to converse on this topic.
Love that. Thank you again. We're really excited that you were able to join us today.
Thanks for having me.
All right, thanks, Liz.
And that's it for this episode of For the Purpose Of. Special thanks to Liz Kolb. Thanks for tuning in. If you like this podcast, we'd love it if you'd share it with a friend.
So where do you think ChatGPT and all the large language models are going to lead us in the future of education and basically the rest of our lives? We'd love to hear from you. We always welcome your feedback. You can reach out and find all of our EdTech things at bit.ly/IamEdTech. That's bit.ly/IAMEDTECH. And you can catch us next time on For the Purpose Of.
This podcast is a service of Kent ISD, produced by Ron Houtman, Sarah Wood, and Keith Tramper, and edited by Keith Tramper. Our theme music is Neon Nights by Scott Holmes Music, and our ad music is Vienna Beat by Blue Dot Sessions.
Dun-dun-dun-dun. Dun-dun-dun-dun.
All right.
Nice.
What's going on?
This is real life.
We're all together.
Sounds about right. That actually sums up the three of us.